Hyman. I teach at Cornell University.
All right. What was the main point of your talk this morning?
So I gave a paper called The Emergence of Lean Ideology in the 1960s and 70s, and it was an intellectual history of how we went from thinking about prioritizing stability and permanence in corporation and in our work to having a more flexible workforce and a flexible corporation. And so the paper traced the history of how certain sets of assumptions came into being, how smallness and nimbleness and efficiency came to refer to one another, and how this came to be common sense. So that something that was almost unthinkable in 1965 became common sense by 1975.
And what was it that was unthinkable in 65?
It was unthinkable that you would have a small business be more efficient and more innovative than a big business. That big business had the resources, big business had the professional managerial staff, big business had the vision. That's why it was big. And suddenly, this all gets flipped around. And so I talk about both the sort of political and economic crises in the late 60s, early 70s, but I also spent a lot of time focusing on a particular set of intellectuals we don't talk that much about, which are management consultants. And so I look at the largest, most important management consultancy, McKinsey & Company, and I trace through their trade journal, McKinsey Quarterly, which is read by CEOs the world over. It is also a handbook for how they restructure corporations in this period. That they do 100 reorganizations a year, and so they are not just thinkers, but practitioners. And so it's for thinking about discourse and how ideas become practice, this seemed essential to me. And so I thought about, well, how do they start to talk about the optimal way to organize a corporation in the 60s, and how does that change by the mid-70s?
All right, so why does it change?
Why does it change?
Yeah.
A certain
sounds like an SDS approach to big business.
Exactly. So it's SDS of big business. So there is a sort of sense of, on the one hand, that R&D in terms of long-term practice is no longer viable. That they feel like there's no way to plan for the future. And I argue that comes out of the way in which there's almost a countercultural movement of the 60s in corporate America. There's a failure, a lack of belief in reason and meta-narrative that we associate with Foucault, but you can also see in the pages of McKinsey Quarterly just the general failure of modernity from all those different sources. But then also the economic crisis. First, the obvious failure of capitalism to include the inner cities, then the capital crunch of 1966, then the fall of the conglomerate stocks in 1969, and then it keeps going and going and going with the stock market crash, Brett Woods. And so all these different kinds of economic crises are also intellectual crises about how capitalism ought to be organized and how capital should be organized. And so into this moment, we start to see a set of opinion makers synthesize ideas, reconnect ideas in new ways that all grow out of the sort of core new belief that instead of size representing strength, size represented weakness.
And are we still in that moment, or is there a new moment upon us?
I think we're very much in that moment. So, the way in which people talk about, in that moment they talked about adhocracy, right? It's when people sort of come with the idea that we should all be organized in teams, we should all have project managers, we should all be free-floating individuals and not be part of anything. That corporations we felt less loyalty to the corporation, and corporations in turn felt less loyalty to us. And this is part of a new project that I'm working on, which is the history of the flexible corporation and temporary work and how that occurred in the late 20th century.
Terrific.
Thanks.